Hello. Today we will explain the plot of the film titled Limitless, released in 2011. Alright, let's dive right into the story. The sound of heavy knocking echoes repeatedly from behind the steel door. Someone is banging on the outside. A man calls out Eddie's name from behind the door. Then the sound of a machine starting up can be heard. Whoever he is trying to force his way in. The word Celestial is written on a wooden panel behind the reception desk. Computer screens show that the system is down, security cameras have lost their signal, and several bodies are lying on the floor. It was clear that the apartment was located inside a modern-style building with a glass-walled lobby. Eddie stood at the edge of the balcony, ready to jump. As a highly intelligent individual, he must have made a wrong calculation. Eddie had nearly succeeded in making a significant impact on the world, but now the only thing that would impact him was the sidewalk below. Eddie crossed the empty street, a cigarette tucked between his lips, looking like a drug addict or an alcoholic. Despite the fact that he was not, he was just a writer, and people might not even believe he had a contract with a publisher. His work was science fiction, telling the story of a utopian society, a person living in the 21st century. That was how Eddie described his idea to a group of men in a bar. But then Eddie lost the words to continue his story. He sat there, lost in thought, only able to type a few words. It was clear that Eddie had lost his inspiration, as instead of writing, he bounced a basketball off the wall, worked out, or hung out in the bathroom reading a book, but nothing happened. Feeling frustrated, Eddie closed his laptop and went to the bar, where he had a drink. After that, the same routine repeated itself for weeks, even months. He watched a Bruce Lee movie while eating a slice of pizza, thinking that at least he still had Lindy. But then Lindy pushed a set of keys toward him, declaring their breakup. Of course, Eddie couldn't believe it was happening. Though for Lindy, it should have been clear. At that moment, Eddie promised he'd submit 90 pages to Marla by Friday and wait for her feedback, but Lindy shook her head, despairing. She knew exactly what was coming. Eddie protested, saying he wanted to spend his life with Lindy, but Lindy begged him not to propose. This request referred to Eddie's failed marriage to Melissa, his college girlfriend, whose relationship didn't work out, and Melissa left him. Lindy smiled softly as she wrapped a scarf around her neck, saying she had to get back to work. Lindy told him she had just been promoted to be an editor, and Eddie was very happy to hear that, thinking Lindy was perfect for the job. Then Lindy left, leaving Eddie alone.
Even though everything you say is true, I still love you.
Eddie walked away dejectedly, lost in his own thoughts. At that moment, a man called out his name. The man was Vernon, his former brother-in-law. They hadn't seen each other in 9 years, and Vern asked how he was doing. Eddie told him that he was still writing and had gotten a book contract. Vern invited him to have a drink, but Eddie seemed hesitant to accept. Finally, they stopped by a bar. Vern was interested in hearing about the book Eddie was writing, but Eddie stammered, admitting that he hadn't finished it yet.
She was right. Why stick it out?
Vern sympathized, saying he might be able to help Eddie. He reached into his jacket pocket, but Eddie immediately refused. It turned out that Vern was still a drug dealer. Vern was slightly offended, claiming he had reformed long ago and now worked as a consultant at a pharmaceutical company. Vern insisted that his product was exclusive and would be released next year after passing clinical trials and receiving FDA approval. Vern placed a small plastic bag containing a single tablet on the table. He explained that there are receptors in the brain that activate specific areas. According to research, we only use 20% of our brain's capacity, and this drug allows us to access the rest. Eddie didn't believe him. He was broke and depressed. He wasn't going to become successful and wealthy just by taking a pill. Their conversation was interrupted by a ringing phone. Vern spoke briefly on the phone, then bid Eddie farewell. According to Vern, Eddie should be grateful because the pill is worth $800 each. Additionally, Vern gave him a business card in case Eddie wanted to contact him. On the way home, Eddie reflected on his life, which was in shambles. No wonder Lindy chose to end their relationship. What could be worse than this? Eddie swallowed the tablet Vern had given him, then climbed the stairs of his old apartment, hoping not to encounter anyone. But his hope was dashed when he bumped into Valerie, the wife of the man who rented the room he was staying in. Valerie greeted him with a lengthy rant about the overdue rent. But something suddenly happened. It felt like all the synapses in his brain were firing, renewing his thoughts, as if he had gained enlightenment.
What this drug would do.
Eddie heard the sound of a bicycle wheel spinning, and suddenly the light became too bright, so much so that he could see the beads of sweat on Valerie's forehead. As if he had been blind all this time and now gained sight, his eyes caught the title of the book in Valerie's bag, while Valerie's ranting sounded so distant, like a buzzing in his ears. Then Eddie asked, what was going on? Valerie couldn't be that angry just because he was late paying the rent. Eddie guessed that Valerie was having trouble with law school. Valerie was stunned. She couldn't believe Eddie knew she was studying law. She felt like Eddie must be a stalker. Eddie explained that only law students carry books about the Supreme Court. He remembered seeing the same book 12 years ago when he was in college, belonging to a friend of his on campus. It turned out that his subconscious had recorded that memory, and now he could access it. Eddie suggested the literature Valerie needed to write her paper. He gave all the information he had gathered from watching the news on TV, and articles he had read was condensed into a stream of words flowing from his mouth. When Eddie entered his apartment, he was shocked to see how filthy and uninhabitable it had become. He began cleaning everything. He washed the dishes, threw away all the leftover food and trash in the kitchen, organized the bookshelves, made the bed, tidied his desk, and moved the sofa. Eddie wondered to himself what kind of drug this was, because he hadn't eaten or smoked for 6 hours, yet he felt perfectly fine. He wasn't high at all, just completely awake and alert. Eddie knew exactly what he had to do and how to do it. He sat down at his desk and began typing on his laptop. Words and sentences seemed to fall from the keyboard, forming a story. When Eddie woke up the next day, he looked for signs of the brilliance he had felt the previous day, but felt nothing. Eddie realized he had returned to his usual self, but something was still there, his manuscript. Eddie placed the brown envelope containing his novel manuscript in front of Marla and persuaded her to read just 3 pages. If Marla still didn't like it, Eddie promised to return the advance payment. Marla looked skeptical, but eventually agreed. When Eddie arrived at his apartment, Marla had left 3 messages on his answering machine. He intended to call Marla, but then decided not to. Eddie decided to meet Vern at the address on his business card. When the door opened, Eddie saw Vern's injured face. Eddie asked about his injury, but Vern acted mysteriously and didn't answer Eddie's question. Vern knew Eddie was interested in the NZT-48 pills he had given him. Here, Eddie realized that Vern had lied about the FDA approval, but he still wanted the pills. Vern promised they would talk about it later, but first, Eddie had to pick up his suit from the dry cleaner and buy food for them. Eddie knew he was being used, but he didn't mind. He was happy to be an errand boy for the pills. After finishing his task, Eddie returned to Vern's apartment and found the door slightly open. The apartment had been ransacked, and Vern was lying dead in a pool of blood. Eddie began to sob in fear, but soon after, he immediately called the police. While waiting, Eddie realized something. He could guess what the killer was looking for, but had they found it? Eddie then put on rubber gloves and began opening cabinets and drawers, flipping through every box and storage compartment. Finally, he found what he was looking for inside the oven, wrapped in aluminum foil and kitchen towels, a small notebook, a stack of money, and a bag containing the tablet. Eddie quickly slipped everything into his pants as the police arrived and banged on the door. He went to the police station to be questioned, and it seemed like the detective conducting the interview was suspicious of Eddie. Melissa called him at the police station, and Eddie asked to meet her, but Melissa refused, saying she had a lot to prepare because of Vern's death. From the police station, Eddie walked back to his apartment, more cautious, but the risk was worth it. He swallowed an NZT-48 pill and felt that sense of clarity return. Eddie walked with confidence. The world now seemed different. He felt like he could see more, his vision broader than before. He tidied his hair, worked out, and bought new clothes. The drug gave Eddie the motivation to finish his book in 4 days. By taking 1 tablet a day, Eddie realized he had unlimited possibilities. In 3 days, he had learned to play the piano, used math to play poker at a casino, and even studied a foreign language. Suddenly, he knew everything. At a party, Eddie talked to a man named Kevin about the human tendency toward greed in the context of business expansion and companies. Eddie became the center of attention, and people listened to his opinions. As Eddie was about to leave, Kevin handed him his business card, suggesting they collaborate someday. Eddie now has new friends, and his lifestyle has drastically improved. His shy nature and low self-esteem have vanished, but he can't stand to relax. His body feels like it's on an endless adrenaline rush. He races sports cars, jumps into the ocean from dizzying cliffs, and feels like he might explode if he stays still. An idea formed in his mind. He knew what he had to do, and it wasn't writing a book. This was something bigger, but it required money to make it happen. Eddie learned that in the stock market, no one made big profits. He used NZT to maximize his analytical abilities. With the remaining $800 from Vern, Eddie could make $2,000 a day, which later increased to $7,500. But this was still not enough. He needed more capital, but the bank wouldn't give him a loan. So Eddie borrowed from a loan shark. In the corner of a restaurant, Eddie met Gennady. Eddie intended to borrow $100,000 and promised to repay it fourfold. Gennady agreed, with the threat that if Eddie had any other intentions, he would face consequences.
I'll tell you.
Eddie began day trading at Kevin's firm and was taught how to double his money by 2.5 times. After more than a week, he increased his NZT dosage to 2 tablets a day to speed up his learning process. His stock analysis caught the attention of many people, and by the end of the week, his trading account contained over $2 million. The news spread widely. Eddie received 4 job offers, a bank offered him a loan, and a reporter wanted to interview him. The climax came when Kevin arranged a meeting with Carl Van Loon. Lindy was shocked to hear about Eddie's meeting with Carl Van Loon. As far as Lindy knew, Eddie wasn't a financial expert, so why were they meeting? Eddie took Lindy out to dinner at an Italian restaurant, where a waiter came to their table and chatted with Eddie in Italian. Eddie had changed a lot, but Lindy was happy and proud to see his progress, though she also felt a little intimidated. Finally, they got back together. One day at the newsstand, Lindy found an article about Eddie, discussing and praising his success in the stock market. Eddie was expressing his desire to buy an apartment together when he caught a glimpse of a man watching him and Lindy. Eddie then took Lindy to his office and didn't think about the man anymore. The night before his meeting with Carl, Lindy stayed awake and saw Eddie standing by the window looking out. The next morning, Eddie felt strange. He saw Lindy at the door asking if he was okay. He was outside his apartment, but he couldn't remember how he got there. Kevin met him at the restaurant before Carl arrived. He wanted to prepare Eddie for this important meeting. Carl then arrived with his partner. After a brief introduction, Eddie explained that his method was based on thorough research. However, when tons of research only yielded minimal profits, he turned to rumors. According to him, stock prices weren't based on how a company operated, but on how mass psychology worked. For Eddie, pattern recognition algorithms were just cheap tricks. Carl became interested in Eddie because Eddie selected stocks in ways he had never seen before. In Carl's car, Eddie's abilities were put to the test. Carl handed him a folder of data and asked for his analysis. Eddie concluded that Carl was planning a massive merger with Hank Atwood's company. Before letting Eddie go, Carl told him to meet him at the St. Regis tomorrow at 10. After Carl's car left, Eddie didn't go straight home. He wanted to keep moving, walking, and processing. This was the opportunity he had been dreaming of. Wall Street was just the beginning. He could even become president. Suddenly, Eddie was confused. How had he walked 20 blocks? The blank period in his memory grew longer, and before he knew it, he had walked another 10 blocks, ending up in the northern part of the city. Eddie was drinking at a bar completely unfamiliar to him, dancing with a woman he didn't know. Then, he stopped by a reception at an art gallery. Somehow, he found himself walking through a hotel corridor with a blonde woman. Then, Eddie saw the man following him. It was the same man he had seen when he was with Lindy. Now Eddie was at the subway station, surrounded by a group of young men challenging him to a fight. He knew nothing about fighting, but then he remembered a scene from a Bruce Lee movie, and his body began to move on its own. His mind recorded every piece of information about self-defense, from movies to Muhammad Ali matches, and after that, he didn't know what happened next, finding himself near a high bridge. Eddie has no memory of what he did during the last 18 hours. Eddie sleeps soundly, unaware that Lindy left a message. When he wakes up, he sees a box full of documents Carl sent for him to study. He reaches for the can where he keeps NZT and finds it empty.
It seemed to cut my learning curve.
Eddie tried to analyze all the documents without NZT, but he couldn't understand them. He called Kevin, telling him he couldn't come because he was sick, but Kevin didn't care. Finally, Eddie went to meet Carl with an empty mind, unable to talk as usual. In the hotel lobby, on the TV news, there was the face of a blonde woman he vaguely recognized. According to the news, the woman named Maria Vinberg had been murdered in a hotel. Eddie could see Carl's lips moving, but he couldn't hear his voice at all and couldn't answer any of Carl's questions. Eddie left the hotel and vomited on the side of the road, afraid that he might have been the one who killed Maria Vinberg. When he returned to his apartment, Melissa called him, and they agreed to meet at a restaurant called Billy's. Eddie then rummaged through a drawer looking for Vern's notebook, hoping Vern had other clients who knew about NZT. He called the numbers in the notebook and found that most of them were already dead, and one was sick. Eddie was sitting on a sidewalk bench when he called the last number. The ringtone sounded close. He turned and saw a man behind him answering his phone. He immediately realized that was the man he had called. Eddie hung up, stood up, and started walking away, but the man followed him. He tried to run quickly, bumping into a woman and nearly getting hit by a truck at the intersection. The truck caused the man to lose track of him, allowing Eddie to escape in a taxi. When he arrived at Billy's, Eddie didn't recognize Melissa because she looked sick and pale. Melissa then told him that she had used NZT 2 years ago. At first, everything went smoothly. Her performance at work was outstanding, but eventually Melissa became terrified because she realized no one could operate at such a high mental activity level without breaking down. Melissa decided to stop, and now she can't concentrate for more than 10 minutes. She started missing deadlines, and she's become lazy and very slow. Melissa told Eddie that he shouldn't stop cold turkey but instead reduce the dosage gradually. On his way home, Eddie was stopped by Gennady, who wanted to collect a debt. Unfortunately, the last NZT tablet Eddie had was snatched by Gennady. Thinking it was a new type of narcotic, Gennady swallowed it immediately, and here Eddie paid off his debt to Gennady. Eddie began to feel the negative effects of NZT. His body felt weak and his face turned pale. He stumbled through the crowd and, feeling unable to reach his apartment, stopped by Lindy's office and collapsed in front of her desk. Eddie was forced to tell everything, including about the NZT stock he had stored in Lindy's apartment. Lindy eventually took the stock, then informed Eddie that she had obtained the medicine, as well as about the man who had been following her since earlier. In the middle of the traffic jam, the man approached Lindy's taxi and Lindy immediately fled without thinking. She ran to the park and asked 2 strangers for help, but the man who had been following her stabbed both of them. Lindy escaped and hid behind large rocks where she saw an ice skating rink in the distance. Lindy was terrified and called Eddie, who told her to swallow the tablet. Eddie assured her that after that, she would know what to do. Lindy swallowed the tablet, and after 30 seconds, the effect kicked in. Everything looked brighter and clearer. She could hear the sound of garden shears, the thud of a baseball bat, and the scrape of ice skates on the ice. Sure enough, Lindy finally knew what she had to do. She ran quickly, climbed over the fence, and entered the skating rink. The man was still chasing her, pulling a knife from his jacket. In the middle of the rink, Lindy grabbed a little girl and swung her body backward, causing the ice skate blade to slice the man's cheek. Lindy saw him fall and bleed, then quickly ran away. Lindy gave Eddie a tablet, then they spent the night at a hotel. The next morning, Lindy said she didn't like the effects of the drug, then left Eddie. Eddie caught Gennady watching the hotel where he was staying and approached him. As expected, Gennady forced Eddie to give him more NZT. He decided to give Gennady a little at a time to buy time until he found a permanent solution to resolve the issue. Eddie hired 2 men as bodyguards to follow him wherever he went. He met with Carl to explain that the last time they met, he had a fever, but Carl wouldn't accept that excuse. Eddie had sent him his revised project and hoped Carl would review it. In fact, Carl did review it and followed Eddie's suggestions. 2 months after Eddie started using NZT, he became the intermediary in the largest merger between 2 companies in history. Eddie presented his analysis to Carl and the company leaders. He now understood that if he took the tablets in a fixed dose and didn't drink any alcohol at all, the blank periods in his mind disappeared. Eddie asked his tailor to make secret pockets in all his suits to store his NZT supply. He also met with a chemical expert and consulted him about the contents of NZT. Eddie promised a payment of $2 million if the man could find the exact formula for how the drug worked. In the midst of his busy schedule, Eddie was named a suspect in the murder of Maria Vinberg. Eddie hired the services of the best lawyer, Morris Brandt, while Carl and Hank Atwood were unaware of the case. During a meeting, Eddie noticed that Hank Atwood was unwell, leaning on a cane and looking very weak. In a brief conversation, Carl implied that Eddie wouldn't be able to succeed alone, and also warned him not to try to compete with him. Eddie found his hotel room in disarray and ransacked, feeling the need for a safer place to stay. He rented an apartment priced at $8.5 million, equipped with a built-in safe, a central surveillance system, and bank-level pneumatic doors, along with an unmatched 3-layer security system. It's a fortress with an extraordinary view. Eddie met with Gennady, who demanded more NZT, accompanied by threats about his suspect status. Eddie was confident the issue would be resolved once Atwood signed the merger agreement and he received his share of $40 million. It was already 10:45 a.m., but Atwood hadn't arrived yet. Soon, Mrs. Atwood came and explained that her husband was being treated at the hospital. Mrs. Atwood assured them that the agreement would be signed as soon as her husband recovered. As Carl and Eddie escorted Mrs. Atwood to her car waiting by the roadside, Eddie noticed that Mrs. Atwood's driver was the same man who had been tailing him all along. There was a long scar on his cheek, and Eddie realized that Atwood was a user of NZT. Eddie wondered how many other successful people were actually using NZT. He was questioned again by the police. This time he had to leave his jacket with Morris, his lawyer. He wore a number on his chest and stood in line with the other suspects so the witnesses could identify them. When he returned to the office, Carl was watching the news about the merger plan. Carl made sure Eddie hadn't leaked the plan to anyone. Since Atwood was now in a coma, Carl asked Eddie's opinion on the situation. Eddie realized he hadn't taken his dose, and the pain began to set in. He rushed to the bathroom and searched for his stash of medication, which had disappeared. When he returned to Carl's office, a female employee handed Eddie a package containing the severed hand of his personal bodyguard. Eddie no longer cared about Carl and immediately left with the package. In his new apartment, the television broadcasts news of the merger. Eddie watches Morris Brandt, his lawyer, who is also the Atwood family's lawyer. He realizes that Morris is the one who took his stash of NZT. Meanwhile, outside, Gennady and two of his henchmen are trying to break into Eddie's apartment. At that moment, Eddie thinks about jumping off the building. However, he changed his mind and remembered that there might still be a tablet left in the can. Eddie began rummaging through his boxes, searching for the can, while Gennady was almost successful in breaking down the door with a cutting machine. Sure enough, there was still one tablet left, but unfortunately, Eddie tripped and dropped it just as Gennady and his two henchmen managed to break in. Eddie was forced to hand over his stash of NZT. Gennady held a syringe and showed him that if the drug was diluted and injected directly into the bloodstream, it would flow to the brain faster and the effects would last longer. At that moment, Eddie's eyes fell on a knife in an open cardboard box. Glancing around, Eddie noticed that one of Gennady's henchmen was blind in one eye. When Gennady was distracted, Eddie slipped the knife behind his back while the henchmen searched the rooms. They found a hidden safe in one of the rooms and began breaking it open with a cutting machine. Eddie took the opportunity to stab Gennady, leaving him dead on the floor. But killing Gennady was pointless, as his two henchmen would eventually kill him too. Eddie stared at Gennady's pool of blood, which was full of NZT, and recklessly drank it. In the room, when the safe was finally opened, inside was only a severed hand that had been sent to Eddie. Meanwhile, the effects of NZT began to kick in. Eddie saw Gennady's syringe nearby. Soon, one of Gennady's henchmen, who was blind in one eye, found Gennady already dead. He turned Eddie's body over, unaware that Eddie would throw the syringe into his eye, leaving him completely blind. Eddie ran toward the door, but it wouldn't open. At that moment, one of Gennady's henchmen fired at him, but missed. Eddie fled into the room and closed all the doors. He then removed the television screen from the wall. When one of them entered, Eddie struck him with the screen, and they struggled for some time. The completely blind man fired shots in all directions. Eddie managed to break free and shouted a sentence in Italian, telling the blind man to shoot at his friend on the right. The blind man didn't realize it was Eddie's voice. The blind man could still sense Eddie's movements and fired at him, forcing Eddie to take cover behind the piano. While staying crouched, Eddie pushed the piano toward the blind man, who fell and hit the glass door, knocking him unconscious. Now, the police would assume the apartment belonged to a weapons dealer in conflict with one of his clients. Eddie quickly left the scene. Atwood finally died. Eddie approached the man with the wound on his cheek in the hospital waiting room and implied that Morris Brandt, his lawyer, had kept the NZT for himself, otherwise Atwood would have survived. Eddie finally managed to retrieve his stash. A year later, Eddie had become a senator running for re-election. His campaign manager informed him that someone from Iben Chemcorp, a pharmaceutical company, was waiting in his office. The man was Carl van Loon, the pharmaceutical company that was the main sponsor of Eddie's campaign, which now belonged to Carl. Carl stated that he knew about NZT because Iben was the one who produced it. There was also a subtle threat implying that Eddie should comply with his wishes to continue receiving the NZT supply. What Carl didn't know was that Eddie had produced it himself, even perfecting it to make it safer for consumption. He threatened Carl in return because he knew about all the illegal activities Carl had been involved in, and without Carl's support, Eddie could still rise to a higher position than he was currently in. After that, Eddie met Lindy for lunch at a Chinese restaurant, where he impressed Lindy with his fluent Mandarin.